The house stood alone, as if forgotten by time itself. Its weathered walls were hidden behind the thick branches of old trees, and on windy days its windows made a soft creak as if it were making anxious sighs. This house knew stories that people would rather forget. Its shadows had secrets that had long since been swallowed up by darkness, and the things left in it seemed to be living memories of its former inhabitants. This place had never been the goal of travelers, but it always seemed to be the point where their roads ended. In the small town, lost among fields and forests, people said that this house did not like visitors. Something older than us lives there, an elderly woman once whispered in the local market square, as if afraid that even her words might attract unwanted attention. It was here, at the crossroads of forest paths, that Agnes stopped. She was well into her 70s, but she was as resilient as a young tree and always had a place in her home for antiques. Her shop had once been famous, but had been closed to customers for many years. Instead of selling things, Agnes collected them, adding them to her collection, which gradually grew in her house. People said that she could find beauty in what others considered junk, but few knew that some of these things had a dark past. Among these antiquities, a mirror held a special place. It stood in the back room, always covered with a black cloth. Its ornate frame was carved from ebony, and it seemed that the deep lines of the carving hid something more than just a decorative ornament. But the main thing was its surface. It was not just glass, it was something more. The dark, almost inky surface seemed to be able to absorb light, reflecting only the shadows of those who looked into it. Agnes got the mirror more than 30 years ago, and she kept it with great care. The first time she touched the frame, her fingers burned with cold, as if the wood had the temperature of ice. Since then, she stayed away from it but never got rid of it. She knew that things, like people, could keep secrets, but this mirror held more than just memories. It held lives that had been destroyed. One evening Agnes was sitting by the fireplace when she heard something rustling in the dark corner of the room. She knew it was just the wind coming through the cracks in the walls, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The woman's gaze fell on the covered mirror. She quickly looked away, but the thought of what was hiding under the fabric kept haunting her. She knew that this mirror was cursed. She knew that everyone who looked into it saw more than they should. Immersed in these thoughts, she did not notice how the dusk turned into night. Outside, the wind howled, making the old walls groan. But the worst was yet to come. At the same time, in the town, Julian, a young journalist looking for sensational stories for his column, came across stories about Agnes's old house. He heard about it from the locals, some whispering about ghosts, others about curses. Julian listened to these stories with a smile, thinking they were fiction. He was attracted to mysticism, but he was always looking for rational explanations. It seemed to him that with every story he made up, he was getting closer to discovering the truth. The next morning was gloomy. The sky hung low, as if to oppress every step. Julian was approaching Agnes's house, looking at it from a distance. He was holding an old camera, ready to capture any evidence of the supernatural. But when he got closer, his confidence was shaken. The house seemed alive, as if it had been expecting him to come. Julian stepped onto the old wooden stairs, and they made a creaking sound that echoed around him. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Holding his breath, he pushed the door, and it opened with a soft creak. Inside the house was the same as outside, gloomy and frozen in time. It seemed to absorb light, leaving only faint glare from the old candlesticks. The room Julian entered was littered with old things. Clocks stopped at different time marks, porcelain dolls stared with empty eyes, and old books reminded him of forgotten wisdom. But in the midst of this chaos, a mirror caught his attention. It stood in the corner, covered with a black cloth, and despite its condition, It looked majestic. Julian took a step toward it, but was stopped by a sound. The old staircase creaked, and he looked around. Agnes was standing in the room. Her gaze was heavy, but not hostile. She stared silently at the stranger who had entered her world. Her eyes slid to the mirror, and an expression of anxiety appeared on her face. Julian felt a ball of tension grow in his chest. His heart was beating faster, but he didn't know why. He was just standing in a room, among old things, but it seemed as if the space itself was weighing him down. He did not know that this was only the beginning. After meeting Agnes, Julian stayed in the house for a while. Although she looked tired, the woman allowed him to examine the antiques, but she stressed one condition: the mirror had to remain covered. It was as if she was afraid of its very existence, and this anxiety was transmitted to Julian. He agreed, although his journalistic curiosity was already boiling over. Agnes told him stories about every object in the room. She showed him antique clocks that never ticked in the same way, porcelain dolls created by unknown masters, books written in languages Julian did not understand. But it was the mirror that caught his eye the most. It stood in the corner, under a black cloth, as if on a throne among the chaos of other things. Every time he looked at it, the room seemed to get colder. Agnes noticed his interest and said, "This mirror is a trap for souls. Don't look into it, or it will show you something you can't handle." Julian just smiled, but deep down he was already in doubt. Could there really be something more than just glass and wood? That evening, Agnes let Julian stay overnight. The house had several guest rooms, but he chose the one closest to the main hall, where there was a mirror. His mind was racing. He wanted to see what was hidden behind that fabric. Julian put the camera next to him in case something interesting happened during the night. He set it to shoot in the dark and lay down on the bed, but he couldn't sleep. Outside, the wind howled, making the old house groan as if it were trying to say something. The clocks in the house ticked in different rhythms, creating a strange melody that only increased his anxiety. Shadows danced on the ceiling from the weak light, and each of them seemed alive. Around midnight, Julian couldn't take it anymore. He left the room and went to the hall. His footsteps echoed off the walls, and with each step his heart beat faster. The mirror was there, still covered with the cloth. He stopped in front of it, feeling a chill creep up his spine. His hand rose, almost of its own accord, and reached for the cloth. But he didn't have time. Not now. Agnes's voice came from the darkness. She stood at the entrance to the hall, her figure seeming unreal in the candlelight. "I warned you. Don't do this." Julian backed away, feeling ashamed. He mumbled an apology and returned to his room. But something inside him had changed. The mirror was now haunting him. The next morning, Agnes disappeared. Julian found only a note on the table. "I have to go. Stay if you want, but don't touch the mirror." It was strange, but he decided to take the opportunity. He was alone in the house, and no one could stop him. He took the camera and went back to the mirror. The cloth looked so ordinary, but underneath it was hiding something that seemed forbidden. He pulled the cloth down with a trembling hand. When it fell to the floor, a mirror opened in front of him. The surface was so smooth that it seemed as if it was not from this world. But instead of his reflection, Julian saw something else. The darkness covering the glass began to move, and shadows appeared. For a moment, he thought it was just his imagination, but the shadows began to form images. At first, they were just fuzzy silhouettes, but they became clearer and clearer. A face appeared in front of him. It was his own, but it was distorted. The eyes were empty, and the skin was covered with black cracks, like broken marble. Suddenly, the face spoke. "Do you want to know the truth? Are you ready to see who you really are?" The voice didn't sound like his own, but it echoed in his head, making Julian stop. The camera in his hands trembled, but he kept filming. The shadows in the mirror began to change. Julian saw scenes from his life. He saw himself as a child, but these memories seemed different. He saw himself betraying friends, deceiving people, running away from his mistakes. Each scene was painful, but he couldn't look away. It was as if the mirror was forcing him to look. Time stopped. Everything around him disappeared, and only the mirror remained. It grew darker and darker, and shadows began to stretch out from it. They reached out to Julian, embracing his body with coldness. He felt something penetrating him, and at that moment he realized that the mirror was not just showing the truth, it was absorbing it. The feeling of fear was so strong that he finally jumped back. The shadows disappeared, and the mirror became normal again. Julian fell to the floor, gasping for breath, and only now noticed that the camera was off. He tried to turn it back on, but it didn't respond. That day was a test for him. Everything he saw seemed like a nightmare, but he knew it was real. He left the mirror open and spent the rest of the day trying to understand what had happened. But as night fell, the fear returned. Every shadow in the house seemed alive. Every sound seemed like footsteps. Closer to midnight, Julian heard something moving in the hall. He gathered his strength and went to look. When he came in, the mirror was covered again with a black cloth. But he knew he hadn't covered it. Trembling, he came closer. When he touched the cloth, it fell by itself, revealing the mirror. This time, instead of shadows, he saw something else, a figure. It was a woman. Her face was pale, and her eyes were empty. Her hair fell in long strands that resembled jets of ink. She looked directly at him, and her gaze pierced his soul. Julian tried to look away, but he couldn't. The woman began to move, her hands reaching for the glass. He felt a coldness envelop the room, and at that moment the lights went out. Julian woke up in the middle of the night. He was lying on the floor, and his camera was working again. But the screen showed only recordings of shadows moving in the mirror. Trembling, he got up and decided to leave the house immediately. But when he reached the door, it would not open. The mirror was left behind, but its reflection now followed him everywhere. The house now seemed to Julian not just old. He felt that its walls were alive, that every step along the corridors awakened something sleeping. The mirror remained the main focus, even when he tried to avoid looking at it. The woman he saw in it never left his mind. Her empty eyes, her hair falling like black fog, and the way she stretched her hands to the glass still held him captive to fear. But now there was one more detail added to it. Cracks sometimes appeared in his own reflection. That night Julian woke up again to a noise. He could hear something rustling quietly in the hall, and he could even feel the floor trembling under his feet. His heart was pounding, but he decided to check it out. The camera was in his hands again, although it no longer seemed such a reliable tool. The shadows around him became deeper, almost physical. When he approached the mirror, it was covered with a cloth, but its edges wavered, as if something was moving underneath. He felt an acute anxiety, but he couldn't stop. His hand reached for the cloth, and this time he did not hesitate. When the cloth fell, the mirror appeared in front of him again, but its surface was no longer smooth. The glass was covered with a web of cracks, and shadows flashed in each of them. Scenes appeared before him again, scenes that were all too familiar. He saw himself in his childhood, in moments he wished he could forget. There he was, standing there watching another boy fall down the stairs at school. Julian remembered that day, but he always convinced himself that it was not his fault. The mirror showed something else. His shadow pushing the boy and the satisfied look on his face. Then another scene appeared. He stood on the threshold of his mother's house, but did not enter. Her voice was coming from behind the door, begging him to come back. She was sick, but he thought at the time that her illness was just an attempt to get his attention. The mirror didn't show his anger, but instead reflected her figure sitting alone in the dark room as her voice gradually faded away. Julian couldn't take it anymore. He stepped away from the mirror, but the images did not disappear. On the contrary, they became clearer, crawling out of the glass as if trying to swallow him up. And then she reappeared, the woman. Her empty eyes seemed filled with cold hatred. She stretched out her hands to the glass, and the cracks in it widened, spreading throughout the room like a spider web. It seemed as if the mirror was tearing the space between this world and something else. When her hand passed through the glass, Julian froze. He felt his body paralyzed. He couldn't move, couldn't even scream. The woman stepped out of the mirror, her long hair wafting around her like black smoke. Her movements were slow but inexorable. Every step she took echoed in his chest, making his heart beat faster and faster. Julian tried to understand what she wanted. He wanted to make excuses, to say that he didn't know what he was doing. But her blank stare was silent, only adding to his despair. Then she spoke. Her voice was not human. It was the whisper of 1,000 voices merging into one. You looked at what you were not supposed to see. You opened a door that was closed. And now, you will be a part of it. The shadows began to gather around her, forming a whirlpool that swallowed up the light. She reached out to Julian, and the coldness that emanated from her made him scream. But his scream dissolved into darkness, and he realized that he too had become part of this world. When Julian came to, he was lying in the corner of the hall. The mirror was covered again, but this time the cloth looked as if it had grown into the frame. He tried to get up, but felt that something had changed. The camera he was holding was nearby, but it wasn't turning on. In its lens, he saw his face, and it was not his face. His eyes seemed empty, as if they no longer had a soul. His skin showed the same cracks he had seen in the mirror. He realized that he was no longer himself. The mirror had taken him, and now he was a part of it. He was a shadow, a reflection, a ghost in the glass. The house became quiet again. The wind no longer howled, and the clock stopped. But something was moving in the mirror, and it was him. Julian sat in silence, feeling that time no longer obeyed the usual laws. The world around him seemed blurry, and every sound seemed to come from another dimension. The mirror was silent again, but now it felt alive. It was no longer just an object. It was a gateway to something bigger, something otherworldly, to a place where all his fears and guilt were stored. He tried to get up, but his legs would not obey. The cracks he had seen in his reflection now felt like real wounds on his body. He touched his face. His skin was still cold, almost stone-like. Panic began to grip him, but he knew that escape was impossible. He felt that the house was holding him. Suddenly, he heard a sound. Something heavy fell to the floor in the next room. Julian gathered the rest of his strength and forced himself to get up. He went out into the hallway, where the air was thick and heavy. Each step sounded louder than usual, and it seemed as if the shadows on the walls were watching him. The sound repeated itself, and this time he felt the floor tremble under his feet. He walked to the door of the room where the noise was coming from. The door was ajar, and he could see the faint flicker of candles behind it. He cautiously stepped inside. It was an old dining room, full of dust and forgotten things. On the table were fragments of a mirror, similar to those he had seen in the main hall, but smaller. Each piece shimmered, as if it had its own essence hiding inside it. Julian felt himself being drawn to the shards. They looked innocent, but each step toward them increased the pressure in his chest. He bent down to touch one of them, but as soon as his fingers touched the glass, images flooded his mind. These were moments not only in his life, but also in the lives of others, people he didn't even know. The people who had looked into the mirror, their fears, their secrets, all of it was captured in the shards. Julian pulled his hand away, but the feeling remained. His mind was filled with strange voices whispering about mistakes, losses, and crimes. He realized that the mirror didn't just show the truth. It collected it, becoming a repository for people's sins. Everyone who looked into it left a part of themselves, and now this part belonged to the mirror. Suddenly, the room was enveloped in darkness. The candles went out, and the shadows began to move. She appeared again, the woman from the mirror. Her figure grew, eclipsing the room. She no longer looked human. Her body was made up of shadows that flowed like black smoke. The eyes remained empty, but now they had something new in them, a power that made him shrink in fear. It drew closer, and Julian felt his body paralyze. He could no longer move, not even scream. Her hand, which was now a cross between a human hand and a shadow, reached out to him. But instead of touching him, she pointed to the wreckage. "Collect them," the voices whispered. It was not a request, but an order. He trembled, but knew he had no choice. Every movement seemed to be a struggle against an invisible force. But he began to gather the pieces. Each new piece he touched brought back images and voices. But he continued. When the last piece was in his hands, the woman came even closer. She leaned toward him, and her face was inches from his. Julian felt a coldness penetrate his soul. She didn't say anything, but her gaze said it all. He was hers now. As he picked up the pieces, he felt something change. The room began to disappear, and instead he found himself in a dark space, surrounded only by the shimmering fragments of a mirror. The woman disappeared, but her presence was still felt. The fragments rose into the air, forming a circle around him. They glowed with a dim light and then began to merge into one. When the mirror recovered, its surface became smooth, but something was moving inside it. It was him, his own reflection, but not quite. The eyes in the mirror were empty, and the cracks in his skin had turned into deep cuts. He realized that he was no longer just a person. He had become part of the mirror, its guardian and its prisoner. The house plunged into silence again. The light returned, but no one was left in it. Julian disappeared, but the mirror remained standing in the main hall. Its surface was smooth and attractive, but everyone who passed by felt a chill run through their skin. People said that if you looked into it, you could see something more than your reflection. And when the next visitor approached the mirror and touched its surface, the cracks began to appear again, and the shadows came to life. Julian's story became just another chapter in the endless book of sins that the mirror was writing. The town came to life with the first rays of the sun, but few people remembered Agnes's house, which stood among the trees. People knew that it held dark secrets, and even casual glances in its direction made the locals feel cold. He stood aside, silent and forgotten, but inside, events were still happening that tore the thin veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead. A week has passed since Julian disappeared. His editor tried to contact him, but to no avail. The police, called by friends, did a cursory investigation, but the house seemed to have no signs of crime or tampering. They did not even dare to approach the mirror, which was covered with a black cloth. Meanwhile, a strange silence reigned in the house. But something began to change. The mirror, which had remained motionless for many years, began to act again. Its surface seemed calm, but anyone standing near it could feel the space around it seemingly thickening. Sometimes faces flashed on the surface of the glass, unclear, blurred, but filled with pain. Julian's face was among them. That evening, a young woman named Laura entered the house. She was a paranormal researcher who had learned about the house and its history from the internet. She was interested in Julian's story and decided to find out more. Armed with a camera, a voice recorder, and a few candles, she crossed the threshold of the house. Laura felt a chill envelop her body as soon as she entered. The air was heavy, and the light from her flashlight seemed insufficient to chase away the thick darkness. She moved cautiously, exploring every corner. She had already written down several pages of stories about the mirror in her notebook, but she wanted to see it with her own eyes. When she entered the main hall, her eyes stopped on the covered mirror. She felt something invisible pulling her toward it. Her heart was beating faster, but curiosity prevailed over fear. She carefully removed the cloth, revealing the smooth surface of the glass. The mirror was unusual. Laura could see her reflection, but it seemed blurry, as if she were looking through a veil of fog. She picked up the camera and started to shoot, but after a few seconds the lens stopped focusing and the camera screen went blank. Laura felt the cold penetrate deeper, but she couldn't tear herself away from the mirror. Suddenly, her reflection began to change. Cracks appeared on the surface, and images emerged from the darkness. She saw Julian standing in the mirror, his eyes empty and his body covered with cracks. He looked as if he wanted to say something, but his voice could not overcome the barrier of glass. Laura tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't listen. Darkness began to gather around her, and a hand appeared from the mirror. It was translucent, made up of shadows, and reached out to Laura. She felt her body gripped by fear, but at the same time it seemed to her that this hand was not a threat, but a plea for help. "Help us!" The voices merged into one, filling the room. Laura gathered her strength and decided to act. She knew that the mirror had to be destroyed. She rushed to look for something heavy to break the glass. Her hands felt an old metal candlestick, and she hit the mirror with all her strength. Cracks spread across the surface, but it did not break. Instead, shadows began to escape from it, filling the room. Laura did not stop. She hit the mirror over and over again until it finally cracked all the way to the center. When the last blow shattered it into pieces, a loud roar filled the house. The shadows disappeared, and the mirror fragments lost their luster. They became ordinary glass, devoid of magical power. But Laura noticed something strange. One of the shards was still glowing with a faint light. She bent down to pick it up and saw Julian's face. He looked calm, his eyes no longer empty. He whispered, "Thank you," and the light went out. Laura left the house at dawn. She left the fragments of the mirror in the forest, away from people. But when she returned home, she felt that something new was haunting her. Blurry shadows sometimes appeared in the mirrors of her apartment, and at night she heard faint whispers. She realized that the mirror was only part of a larger story, and that her part in it had just begun. Agnes's house remained standing, once again engulfed in silence. But now, there was no longer a mirror in it, although its shadow remained. And the legend continued to live on, passed down from one person to another, changing forms, but always returning to the same question. Are you ready to look at your truth?